Over in Europe, the sun sets on the Western Roman Empire. The last vestige of the Western Empire emerges as a rump state in northern Gaul, ruled by Roman general Syagrius. But this is a new age, and Europe is to be inherited by those Rome once regarded as barbarian. You don't need to watch our Ancient World mega-documentary, or our video on Rome, but we pick up where those left off. The Germanic peoples, which had been migrating deeper into Europe, began to set up their own kingdoms on the corpse of a fallen empire. Just a few decades after the last Western Roman emperor was deposed, these Germanic societies now ruled through their own kings, and over time, with a healthy dose of Roman culture shining through. To no surprise, this was especially the case in Italy, where Germanic and Roman traditions fused more than anywhere else. Odoacer has deposed the last Roman emperor, and takes for himself a new title, King of Italy. But Odoacer's kingdom was not even 20 years old when the Eastern Goths struck. The Ostrogoths set up their own Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy in 493, after killing Odoacer, and became inheritors of the city of Rome. Their first and greatest king, Theodoric, retained the old Roman system of laws for his Roman subjects, but his fellow Ostrogoths lived by their own rules and customs. In the 500s, the kingdom was conquered by the Eastern Roman Empire. We'll get to the Byzantine Empire in our next video, the last of our Medieval World series, so be sure to subscribe. Another Germanic people moved into the region and conquered northern Italy by 568. They were the Lombards, or Langobards, and set up their own Lombard kingdom, which would endure for over 200 years. To the west was another branch of the Goths. These were the Visigoths, or Western Goths. After sacking Rome back in 410, they ended up taking over Spain, establishing their Visigothic kingdom in 418. Like their eastern brethren in Italy, the Visigoths kept Roman institutions, but had separate laws for their own. Nestled between these European kingdoms was perhaps the most powerful of them all. In the late 400s, Clovis I was crowned king of the Franks, another Germanic society. He was the first of the Germanic kings to convert to Catholicism, or Chalcedonian Christianity, as opposed to the Arian sect, which believed the body of Jesus was human and not of God. Arianism was seen as heretical by the Church, as it opposed the official stance that Jesus and God are of the same substance. While Clovis was initially interested in Arianism, adopting Catholicism gave him the support of the Church. By the early 500s, Clovis had defeated the kingdom of Soissons in Gaul, conquered the Alemanni, and defeated the Visigoths at the Battle of Vouillé. The kingdom of the Franks, or Francia, was the center of Europe. When Clovis died, Frankish custom was to divide the land between heirs. Over the decades, the Merovingian dynasty expanded to take over more of Western Europe, leaving Francia divided into different regions. The four major ones were Austrasia, the old Frankish homelands, Neustria, consisting of the former Gallo-Roman land, Aquitaine, a part of the Visigothic kingdom, and Burgundy, former territory of the Burgundians, another Germanic society that had once been allied to the Franks. As time went on, society changed significantly from the time of the Romans. Germanic people intermarried with Romans from the former empire, but it was the Germanic social structure that dominated. Males were the heads of the household, and women would be responsible for domestic affairs, including some farm labor. Most women lived to only around 30 or 40. Under the old Roman law system, which is still similar to our own, crimes were treated as an affront against society as a collective, and were handled by the state. In Germanic law, crimes were more individualistic. If a crime was committed against someone, it could turn into a blood feud between families, often with gruesome and vengeful results, like chopping off hands or gouging out eyes. As this wasn't a sustainable system for the expanded Frankish territories, a newer alternative was adopted, called the Wehrgeld, which means man price. In this system, the criminal simply had to repay the family which they had wronged. This sum of money could vary wildly, depending on if the victim's family was of noble birth. The most controversial aspect of Germanic law was the ordeal. This was a means of determining guilt or innocence. Usually, the suspect was placed in a situation that was either painful, unpleasant, or dangerous, and was based on the judgment of God. It was thought the gods would not allow an innocent person to be harmed, so if they were harmed or killed, then they must have been guilty. During the 300s, the Christian Church had developed a deep bureaucracy of its own, and would come to dominate Europe heading into the early Middle Ages. Though it started small and had gone through periods of persecution, its adoption by the Roman Empire allowed it to thrive and develop into a system of both religious and political power. During the late Roman period, the empire was divided into different ecclesiastical districts, each called a diocese, with bishops as heads of the local Christian communities. They were collectively under the direction of an archbishop, who had jurisdiction over the larger ecclesiastical province. Catholic doctrine stated Peter was the most prominent and influential of the apostles, and that he was delegated by Jesus to rule over the entire church. Peter became the first bishop of Rome, and from then on, they would be known as popes, from the Greek word papas, meaning father. By the early Middle Ages, the church had found a powerful ally in the Frankish kingdom and worked to convert even more pagans. This was ironically done through a movement of those who wished to be left alone. These were the monks. The word monk is derived from the Latin word monachus, which means one who lives alone. Their goal was a life apart from the world, apart from family, to dedicate themselves to worship. This was a difficult life, so small communities soon grew, a movement called monasticism. Benedict of Nursia, an Italian monk, founded many of these communities near Rome and in the mountains of central Italy in 529. He later became known as Saint Benedict, and his order of monks became the Benedictine order. Benedict created a set of rules for the monks, emphasizing not just prayer, but physical activity. It was a communal lifestyle, which allowed monks time alone to read and pray, but they would also gather to pray together several times a day, as well as eat and work. They also promoted bathing together as a therapeutic activity, and are thought to have played a role in the development of spas. They lived in a monastery, and these were headed by an abbot. He had authority over all the monks, and they were to be subservient to him. He could delegate work to his monks, as they needed to farm their own land for food. They were entirely self-sufficient, and did not need to travel to neighboring cities. They were to live by a vow of poverty, so there was really no need to leave their enclaves. Monastic life became the apex of Christian living in the early Middle Ages. Monasteries became places of aid in their communities. Travelers could rest their weary legs here, the sick could get help, and youngsters could get educated. Perhaps even more importantly, monks were responsible for preserving and copying many of the texts from the ancient world in the West, allowing these monasteries to become the new centers of knowledge. Soon, women would also form their own communities like the monks, becoming nuns. These were called convents. The head of a convent was called the abbess. They were usually from richer backgrounds, and were instrumental in the Christianization of Europe. Hilda of Whitby founded the monastery at Whitby in the mid-600s, and was renowned for her wisdom and conversion of Anglo-Saxon England. The spread of Christianity here was also due to the efforts of Saint Augustine of Canterbury, a probable Italian monk who became the apostle to the English in the late 500s. Saint Patrick was a Romano-British who conducted missions to Ireland, and Saint Boniface, an Anglo-Saxon, helped to spread Christianity to the Germanic tribes on the continent. The church became a powerful political and cultural force, and monasteries played a key role in preserving and transmitting knowledge, including works of literature and philosophy. Back in the Frankish kingdom, the kings began losing control in the 600s and 700s, and power reverted to the local mayors. In 751, with the consent of the Roman Church, the Merovingian dynasty was overthrown by Pepin the Short, who became the new Frankish king. He was the son of Charles Martel, the famous hammer that struck down and halted the Umayyad invasions at the Battle of Tours. With Pepin, the throne was now in the hands of a new dynasty, the Carolingians. One of Pepin's sons was a charismatic and deeply pious Christian who, like his grandfather, was named Charles. Because of his above-average height, he was known as Charles Magnus or Charlemagne. Though he only learned to read in his adulthood and never fully knew how to write, he was still a highly intelligent leader and military strategist. In a series of ambitious campaigns, he expanded the Frankish kingdom throughout continental Europe. One of these campaigns was into northern Italy, conquering the Lombards, and to the northeast, leading to the Saxon Wars, a 33-year struggle with the German pagans. Charlemagne destroyed their sacred Irminsul pillar, and in 782, ordered the killing of 4,500 Saxon nobles, in what has been called the Massacre of Verdun. He later forced the Saxons and their leader, Wittekund, to surrender and convert. Wittekund, whose name means child of the woods, later became a symbol of Saxon independence. In 800, on Christmas Day, the Church named Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans and ruler of the Carolingian Empire. His empire was the first in Europe since the Romans, and it would be another 1,000 years before the continent saw another as large. Charlemagne administered his immense empire through counts, who acted as his representatives. To keep the counts in check, 2 envoys of the king, called a missus Dominicus, were sent to the districts to make sure the counts acted in Charlemagne's best interest. They even had the power to depose the counts if they abused their positions. His empire was a fusion of Germanic, Christian, and Roman traditions, bringing about a period of cultural and intellectual revival called the Carolingian Renaissance. After uniting much of the continent, he was later dubbed the Father of Europe, or Pater Europae. In 814, Charlemagne died, but what was to become of his empire? It went to Louis the Pious, his only surviving son with his second wife. Louis remained sole ruler of the Franks, extending the Carolingian Renaissance until he was deposed in the 830s. Civil war broke out between his sons, and by 843, the Treaty of Verdun divided the Frankish Empire into 3 kingdoms. It was the first of numerous partitions until 880. The easternmost of the kingdoms was called East Francia, under Louis the German. The westernmost kingdom was West Francia, under Charles II, or Charles the Bald, who might have been quite hairy. In between was Middle Francia, a corridor containing what would become the Low Countries, the Rhineland, and reached south to northern Italy. Because the kingdoms were still rivals, Middle Francia often came under attack from its neighbors. But there were foreign foes as well. The 800s and 900s brought with it more invasions. From the east, most likely from Western Asia, or the steppes of Eastern Europe, a tribe came to settle on the Carpathian Basin, and sent waves of invasions into Western Europe. These were the Magyars, or Hungarians, a people with a mysterious past. Consensus is that they are non-Indo-European, with a language related to the Finnish, or Estonian, and originally migrated from the Ural Mountains during the Bronze Age. Their invasions into Western Europe came to an end at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955. The Magyars then converted to Christianity, and established the Kingdom of Hungary in the year 1000. Britain saw waves of invasions itself. By the ancient period, the islands of Britain and Ireland had been inhabited by Celtic tribes. Separated from their continental cousins, they would be given the name Insular Celts. There were 3 main groups. The Britons occupied the majority of Britain, the Picts, or Caledonians, were in the north, the mountainous Scottish terrain, and the Gaels lived on Ireland and the Isle of Man. After the Romans came and went, they left behind a large group of Romanized Britons, or Romano-British. Raids from the north were common, by both the Picts, and a Gaelic group the Romans called the Scotti, who crossed over from Ireland. To further complicate matters, Germanic tribes from northern Germany and Denmark also arrived on the shores. They were the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. The Saxons had been raiding Britain since Roman times, and the Romans even named their favorite attack shore after them. It's possible the Angles and Saxons were recruited as mercenaries, but it's more certain the expansion that came next was by force. One of the main defenders of the Britons against the Anglo-Saxons was Ambrosius Aurelianus, who could have been the inspiration for the story of King Arthur. Despite fighting valiantly, the Romano-British were displaced, as the Anglo-Saxons set up their own kingdoms. Even worse invasions came from the east. These North Germanic people would savagely seek plunder and brutal warfare for the sake of an adventure. These were Norsemen, from the coldest reaches of Europe, in Scandinavia. They were more commonly known as Vikings. Their dragon-headed ships allowed the Vikings to remain highly mobile on the seas, and their slim build was perfect to navigate inland on the tight European rivers. These long ships were built to be narrow raiding ships, carrying around 50 men each. In 793, Britain was shattered by a new invasion which would mark the start of the Viking Age. The holy island of Lindisfarne, in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, was attacked. The abbey was destroyed, the monks slaughtered, the valuables taken. These Vikings were known to show little mercy for the towns and villages they invaded. Churches would be burned, and the disjointed village armies easily defeated before larger armies could get there. Some Vikings even settled on the outer reaches of Scotland and Ireland, and mixed to create a new Norse Gael identity. Scottish clans like Clan MacDougall, Clan MacDonald, and Clan MacLeod have Norse Gaelic roots. After Lindisfarne, Danish Vikings who had been raiding France and Germany formed a great army and turned their attention on the English. By 878, most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had fallen or surrendered. Only Wessex held out under Alfred the Great. He made an agreement with the invaders to divide the English lands between the Anglo-Saxon and Viking, a region that came to be known as Danelaw, as the Danish law was different than the Wessex or Mercian law. But in the end, the Anglo-Saxons reconquered most of the island from them. By the mid-900s, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were unified into a larger state, the Kingdom of the Angles, or England. Aethelstan of Wessex is generally regarded as the first true king of England. The Britons who were displaced moved either off the island or remained in the west, in Wales and Cornwall. In the north, the Picts had mysteriously vanished, most likely having merged with the Scottish. By the start of the High Middle Ages, the three main cultural divisions in Britain were the Anglo-Saxon English, the Brittonic Welsh, and Gaelic Scottish. Back on the continent, the mid to late 800s saw West Francia besieged by Vikings, all the way to Paris, and the invaders were only appeased with what was called the Danegeld. In other words, payments to go away. In 911, Charles the Simple gave Rollo, the leader of the Viking raiders, a piece of land at the mouth of the Seine River, as well as his daughter's hand in marriage, in exchange for Rollo's conversion to Christianity. Rollo accepted, and reflecting his Norse origins, this territory would come to be known as Normandy, one of the most important duchies in Western Europe. Rollo and his band even held off other invaders from traveling down the Seine, and Paris remained safe. As the political powers in Europe at the time were so decentralized, they couldn't be expected, nor were they able, to protect the commoners. People would have to seek out their own protection, in the form of local lords. Once under their protection, you became their vassal, and pledged your service. With a weak central government, the lords and noblemen created their own personal, private armies in exchange for land. Frankish armies had usually just been foot soldiers, protected with mail and armed with a sword. But by the 700s, the Franks relied more on horsemen, after the adoption of the stirrup from the nomadic equestrians of the Asian steppes. Horsemen usually began as projectile units, throwing spears, but breeding larger horses led to a new class of fully armored fighter. These could be heavy armored cavalry, or as they are known to us, the fearsome knights. This was a word derived from boy, or servant. They could use the sword, but employed the deadly long lance, which could also be used as a kind of battering ram. Knights dominated European warfare for centuries, and were the highest class of fighter. Though they came to be depicted as heroes, there was little that separated them from the violent warlords in other parts of the world. Because trade and commerce were at a low point during the early Middle Ages, economy was mainly produced in the fields. These lands, known as fiefs, were owned by lords. It was held by his vassals in exchange for their military service, and these vassals held legal authority over the lands. This feudal system kept order during the tumultuous invasions and disintegration of the Carolingian Empire. There was even a further process that developed, called subinfeudation, in which a knight or vassal, acting as a lord themselves, recruited their own vassals for military service, granting them a smaller piece of land. Vassals didn't have to spend their whole time fighting for their lords. They were only mandated to serve a short time, around 40 days a year. They were also responsible for court appearances whenever summoned, and as aid in legal cases, as well as financial payments for weddings, or ransom. Apart from land, the lord was responsible for gathering the army to defend his vassal, and protect him legally if needed. Lords would live on their own landed estates, with plenty of farmland that was worked by peasants. This was called a manor. Many peasants, with no land of their own, became serfs, able to live on the manor, but needed to provide labor and pay rent. Over half the population in Western Europe became serfs during this time, but the practice would later spread to Eastern Europe. Serfs were bound to their land, and could not leave without permission of the lord. They were also not allowed to marry outside the manor without permission. Legally, their rights were at the discretion of the lord as well, as lords could set up their own courts. The part of the manor that was used by the lord himself was called the domain, or domain, and this piece of land could be between 1/3 and half of the entire manor. The early Middle Ages was a time of decentralization, but by year 1000, Europe emerged into a new great civilization, ushering in a new age. The High Middle Ages. New food surpluses, and the development of urban centers, brought an economic surge. Having recovered from the earlier invasions, centralized power started to return, in the form of medieval monarchs. The church continued to be a presence in everyday life as well. Warmer weather conditions increased food production, and populations doubled. More widespread use of iron in farming devices and building materials further advanced agricultural practices. The karuka was a heavy plough used in Northern Europe, made of iron, and able to turn heavy soils. It could have required from 4 to 8 oxen to function, and was likely introduced to the British Isles during the Viking invasions of England. Watermills and windmills also became more widespread, using nature's powerful currents to grind grain into flour. The usage of water and wind became the best methods of harnessing power, and would remain this way until the invention of the steam engine. During the early Middle Ages, farmers relied on a two-field system, where they would work one field and let the other lie fallow, to regain its nutrients. During the High Middle Ages, a three-field system became common, where one field produced grains for one season, and the second had different grains for a different season. This reduced the unused field to just 1/3 instead of half. While not working the fields, the peasant classes lived simple lives in small cottages made of wood and clay, and thatched roofs of straw. Most only had a single room, but some oh-so-lucky peasants had an extra room, for cooking and eating. Men would be mainly responsible for the farming labor, but women would be required to participate during harvest season. Their main duties were smaller-scale gardening, religious training for their children, and spinning and weaving clothes for the family. Though serfs only had to work a few days a week for their lords, and were given numerous holidays per year, They spent their off time laboring for their own sustenance. Bread was their staple food, and contained wheat, rye, barley, millet, and oats, making it a high-calorie and quite nutritious food. If the family had other animals, they could supplement their bread with eggs, chicken, or cow's milk. While peasants remained near the bottom of the social hierarchy, at the other end were the nobles, lords, and their vassals. Kings, dukes, counts, barons, viscounts, and religious organizations controlled politics and society through their wealth and land holdings. By the middle of the High Middle Ages, a code emerged among knights and nobility, an ethical ideal promoted by the Church. Knights were bound to act in a moral and civilized manner, protecting the Church and peasants, and treating prisoners and women with respect, especially noble women. While the early Middle Ages saw a decline in trade and commerce, there was a resurgence in the High Middle Ages. There was always trade between the still prominent Byzantine Empire and cities on the Italian peninsula. Venice, a city that emerged in the 700s, would become one of the foremost trading cities in Europe by the High Middle Ages, based upon their fleets of trading ships. These medieval merchants set up trading posts abroad, and specialized in trade in the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Once the Mongols spread throughout Asia in the 1200s, they brought a period of stability known as the Pax Mongolica, giving merchants safe passage through the empire. This was when two Venetian brothers, Maffeo and Niccolo Polo, traveled through the Mongol Empire. Respectively, they were the uncle and father of explorer Marco Polo. The Italian cities would trade primarily along the Mediterranean, but northern Europe was resurgent as well. Flanders, along the coast of present-day Belgium, traded in woolen cloth, and became a trading center in the north. It saw merchants from England, France, the German lands, and Scandinavia gather to buy and sell their wares. Brugge and Ghent became the main centers here. By the 1100s, the two trading hubs in Flanders and Italy had regular exchange with each other, linking northern and southern Europe's economies. Nobles in Champagne in northern France held annual fairs, where the merchants from northern Europe could meet and exchange their furs, woolen cloth, and tin, with the southern European merchants' wares from Italy, mainly silks and spices from Asia. As trade increased, gold and silver became more in demand, and eventually, banks were established to manage exchange, and trading companies emerged to manage the sale of goods. This brought about a commercial revolution, as new private businesses, incentivized by profit, were set up for insurance, commercial contracts, and bookkeeping. Commerce and industry became governed by these private entities. As smaller decentralized towns and villages dominated the early Middle Ages, the explosion of trade and increased population of the High Middle Ages led to a revival of urban centers and large cities. Cities below the Alps, closer to the former imperial Roman core, were less affected, but decreased size nonetheless. Merchants began to settle in these towns, along with artisans and other manufacturers who could sell their products through the nearby traders. Soon, the old Roman cities were bustling once more. Further north of the Alps, with fewer large cities, merchants had to set up shop near a protected space, usually a castle, but sometimes monasteries. Castles were where local lords resided, and emerged during the period of decentralization after the breakup of the Carolingian Empire, as a means to fortify the lord's position. Cities would slowly grow around these defensive castles. It is from here that many cities get their suffix "burg", as the word means fortification or fortress in Old German. Before castles emerged in England, the Anglo-Saxons relied on fortified settlements called burhs, often on the sites of old Roman hill forts. As these cities grew, the fortifications grew as well, and city walls expanded. The relationship between the lord and the merchant classes that made up the town was very different than the relationship between the lord and serf on a manor. Those who lived in these burgs were called burghers, a word which would eventually turn into bourgeoisie. These people needed to be able to come and go as they pleased and needed their own unique laws. They paid the lord for the ability to live on his land and sell their properties, and the freedom from any military obligations. Some of these cities were even granted the right to govern themselves. But sometimes, they took the right by force. In northern Italy, bishops acted as lords, and had their own vassals. But if the bishop became corrupt, or too authoritative, the townsfolk would swear an oath of allegiance to each other, and form an association called the commune, and self-administer. This succeeded, as the bishop's noble vassals took the side of the cityfolk and overthrew the bishops. They were able to become independent and create their own independent city-states. North of the Alps, communes weren't as successful, as the noble vassals were less prone to go against their lords, and any form of rebellion was suppressed. Even in the rare cases that the cities, called free cities, did succeed, they would never truly become independent, like the cities of Italy. This made these cities quite different from one another. They had varying degrees of autonomy, and different forms of government and council. Males were regarded as citizens, and could be elected to city council as city officials. The free cities never rivaled the size or populations of the busy urban centers of the ancient world, with the average trading city at only around 5,000 people. Bigger cities, like London, could have had around 30,000, and on the continent, Brugge and Ghent, the trading hubs of the north, had around 40,000. In Italy, urban centers were much larger, with trading hubs of Naples, Venice, Genoa, and Milan, all around 100,000 inhabitants. Though populations were so small in European medieval towns, life was noisy and cramped. Because the town was surrounded by protective walls, space inside needed to be filled, as wall expansion was quite expensive. This became a fire hazard, as most buildings were still made of wood. The cities were generally made of both artisans, who created a wide variety of products from cloth, metalworks, and much more, and the merchants who would sell these wares. The merchants and artisans each had their own areas in a city. The merchant section was where you would find the taverns, to drink to your merriment, and the inns, to rest thy tired legs. The artisan section was usually divided into areas with different crafts. Those performing the same crafts would band together to create a guild, and eventually guilds became widespread among the artisan class. The tight spaces and lack of sanitation system left these cities awfully dirty though. Animal and human waste could be found in between buildings, or in the streets. Nearby rivers were also polluted because of other industries, so townsfolk had to use wells instead. Thankfully, some cities had public baths. Paris, with a population of around 200,000, had dozens of public baths, open to both men and women, as long as you don't have leprosy. Women in these cities had their own roles. Apart from the domestic duties of preparing food and raising the children, they were also given the task of managing the family finances, and helping their husbands with their craft. Sometimes, these women would even have side hustles, like making ale. If their husbands died, they could easily continue with his work, as they had worked alongside him prior, and it gave them more independence. Despite some similarities across this new European culture, each region took different paths during the High Middle Ages, as strong monarchs across the continent attempted to establish more centralized kingdoms. The first place we'll travel to is Britain. After being unified in the early 900s, England would endure under the Anglo-Saxons, minus a brief period as part of the North Sea Empire, a personal union with Denmark and Norway, under Canute the Great. After the Anglo-Saxons regained the throne, Edward the Confessor, last king of the House of Wessex, died without an heir in 1066. The Witan, the Anglo-Saxon King's Council, proclaimed Harold Godwinson the new king, but he was opposed by two claimants to the throne. His own brother Tostig, who invited the Norwegian Harald Hardrada, were both defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, on September 25. But by September 28, a new contender landed on the southern shore. Sailing from France, they were headed by yet another who claimed to be the righteous inheritor to the throne. This was William, Duke of Normandy, and direct descendant of Rollo. He brought with him an army of mounted knights, archers, and infantry. King Harold, weary from Stamford Bridge, had to march south quickly, mustering troops along the way, and met William at the Battle of Hastings, just 2 weeks later, on October 14th. The Normans couldn't break Harold's lines, composed mainly of foot soldiers, so baited the enemy army by pretending to retreat. The ruse worked, and William gained the upper hand. Harold was killed in the battle, and his army defeated not long afterwards. He was to be the last Anglo-Saxon king. William, henceforth known as William the Conqueror, was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, and the royal residence was moved from Winchester to London. This marked the beginnings of the integration of Norman and Anglo-Saxon culture, with elements of Celtic, Gallo-Roman, and Germanic traditions. William's first order of business was to centralize the government. English nobles had to swear loyalty to the Norman king. Taxation and the royal court systems from the Anglo-Saxon period were strengthened. The Norman conquest brought with it further complications. Though William was the new King of England, he was still the Duke of Normandy, and a vassal to the King of France. As France had a weaker government at this time, this made William more powerful than his own lord, and further meshed the affairs of England and France. After a civil war that dragged on from 1138 to 1153, another royal house from France, the Plantagenets, assumed the throne under King Henry II. These kings came from Anjou and would be known as the Angevin kings. Henry strengthened his authority by strengthening the royal courts. Local courts would be denied certain cases, which were instead placed under the king's authority. As the number of royal courts increased throughout the kingdom, this brought with it a standard of law, or common law. His holdings were vast, and at different points, held power over Wales and Ireland. On the continent, as the Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, he held those areas of France as well, along with Aquitaine through marriage. Collectively, this formed a dynastic union called the Angevin Empire, a nightmare for the French king, which resulted in 100 years of rivalry between the French Capetian royal house and the Plantagenets. Back in England, Henry had much more trouble exerting power over the church. An argument erupted between Henry and his friend Thomas Becket, whom he had just appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest cleric in the Church of England. The controversy, known as the Becket dispute, was mostly over whether royal courts had jurisdiction over clerics. This dragged on for years, with both sides appealing the Pope. In response to Becket excommunicating bishops who supported him, King Henry reportedly yelled out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" This prompted 4 knights to travel from Normandy to Canterbury, and murder Thomas Becket, just 4 days later. As the power of the monarch grew, resentment was brewing among the nobility. During the reign of King John, a group of barons forced the king to sign the Magna Carta Libertatum, or the Great Charter of Freedoms. This check on royal power promised the protection of church rights, protection from illegal imprisonment, access to swift justice, and, most importantly, limitations on taxation and other feudal payments to the crown. Though it was a failure in the end, it set up the framework of rights between the monarch and his subjects, with legal recognition that the monarch's powers were absolutely not absolute. This trend would continue further into the High Middle Ages, with Edward I, son of Henry III, the longest reigning monarch in English history until the 20th century. Meetings in the king's court often occurred between his royal advisors and the barons, but in 1295, Edward invited representatives, 2 knights, and 2 town residents, called burgesses, from every county and town to a grand council. These parliaments discussed laws, taxes, and other political and judicial matters. And so, England was on the path to a more representative government. Edward's reign remains controversial though, as his edict expelled the Jews from England, and he led an invasion into Scotland, claiming sovereignty over it. This led to the First Scottish War of Independence, which saw the likes of William Wallace and Robert the Bruce become national Scottish heroes. On the continent, the forging of France would continue. After the Carolingian Empire had been divided up, it was West Francia that would become the main territory of what would become France. In 987, the last of the Carolingian dynasty perished without an heir, and the Western Franks chose a new king. He was Hugh Capet. The new kingdom of France would be ruled by this Capetian dynasty, the House of Capet and its cadet branches, the houses of Valois and Bourbon, uninterrupted until the monarchy was abolished during the French Revolution. But to start off, the Capetian kings had very little power. Though they were the lords of their vassals, including the kings of England through their holdings in western France, early Capetian kings only controlled Paris and a small territory around the city, collectively called Ile-de-France. A turning point came during the reign of Philip II, who was given the epithet of Philip Augustus, because of his centralization and expansion campaigns. He declared war on the House of Plantagenet and started taking back their French holdings on the continent. With his new domain, he collected more revenue and hired more officials, strengthening his kingdom. Later French kings, like Louis IX, halted further English attempts to restore the Angevin Empire. A treaty was signed, where the English king relinquished his claims to most of his French territories, and remained a vassal to the French king for those lands he still held. The treaty was the start of a growing resentment and rivalry between the English and French that would culminate in the late Middle Ages. Under Philip IV, called Philip the Fair, the monarchy was further reinforced. Philip did have a parliamentary process himself, although it was virtually powerless. It was a precursor to the Estates General, wherein he brought in representatives from the clergy, or First Estate, the nobles, the Second Estate, and townsfolk, the Third Estate. He transformed France from a feudal state into a centralized nation-state, the largest and richest in all of Europe. To the west, the early Middle Ages saw most of the Iberian Peninsula under the control of a number of different Muslim states, a region later called Al-Andalus by historians. But the Christian kingdoms to the north fought back. They began as a single kingdom called Asturias, and later the Kingdom of Leon. Other kingdoms coalesced, like Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and Portugal. In 1085, King Alfonso VI captured Toledo, and the balances of power started to sway. Córdoba fell later to the King of Castile, and by 1249, only the Muslim holding of Granada remained. In 1492, the Emir of Granada, Mohammed XII, surrendered to Isabella of Castile, completing the Reconquest, or Reconquista. During the Reconquest, some Spanish rulers encouraged diversity, like King Alfonso X, who developed a cosmopolitan court full of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and translated Arabic and Latin sources. Other rulers, though, were more harsh, and there were times of severe anti-Semitism, like the massacre of 1391. After the Reconquest and the Alhambra decree, Jews were forced to convert or be expelled. The Muslims who remained in Spain were also forced to convert, and Islam was banned by the Queen. On the other side of France was East Francia. By the early 900s, Henry the Fowler was elected king, the kingdom's first non-Frankish ruler. By the mid-900s, his son, Otto, sat on the throne. Like his father, he was a Saxon, hailing from the northern Duchy of Saxony. This continued a shift that would set it apart from West Francia, now known as the Kingdom of France, and towards becoming the region that would be known as the Kingdom of Germany. The former Carolingian Empire was divided by this point, with the Kingdom of Italy partitioned off, but Otto set out and conquered northern Italy and became their king. After fending off the Magyar invasions, he was hailed as a hero of Christendom, and was proclaimed Emperor of the Romans in 962. Today, we call this the Holy Roman Empire. At its greatest extent, this empire would consist of the Kingdom of Germany in the center, the Kingdom of Burgundy to the west, the Kingdom of Bohemia, a Czech kingdom to the east, and the Kingdom of Italy to the south, but each were governed by their own leaders. To the south of the Kingdom of Italy, in the central region of the peninsula, were the Papal States, former Lombard territory formerly given to Rome by Charlemagne. This made the popes much more involved, not just in spiritual, but political matters. Many high-ranked clergy, like bishops and monastery abbots, were often given fiefs by a lord, making them vassals. This soon presented a problem, as church leaders didn't want lords appointing their own nominees and investing them with church powers, a practice called lay investiture. In the 1070s, Pope Gregory VII fought back. He came up with the Gregorian reforms, and affirmed the primacy of the Pope and Papal States in all matters involving the Christian kingdoms and its rulers, including the power to depose an emperor. In essence, he forbade investiture from lay lords. This placed him at odds with the German king, Henry IV. Henry had used lay investiture to his benefit, appointing bishops of his choice as his vassals and using them as administrators in his territories. This would lead to a 50-year conflict between church and state, known as the investiture controversy. Henry had even appointed his own antipope to counter Pope Gregory. In 1122, the king's son, and new Holy Roman Emperor, Henry V, signed a written agreement with the new pope. The terms were that the church was to appoint abbots and bishops through canonical elections, and the pope's representatives were to perform the investiture, symbolized through a ring and staff. The king in turn was allowed to preside over elections and arbitrate disputes. In the 1100s and 1200s, the Hohenstaufen dynasty, most prominently under Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II, attempted to exert their power on the Kingdom of Italy and Rome, in order to assemble a true Holy Roman Empire. But Germany was a decentralized state of duchies with their own interests, and the kings could not muster up sufficient armies. The northern Italian cities, backed by the Papal States, banded together, forming the Lombard League, and pushed back the German offensives. By the late 1100s, the northern Italian states won their right to self-government, but remained in the empire, simply paying a tax to the German king. The time and resources used by the Hohenstaufens in Italy only resulted in more weakening of their own dynasty. They had only lost power in Italy, and with little presence in Germany, the local lords were left to their own devices. The Holy Roman Emperors ended up not as rulers of an empire, but rulers of their own estates. Southern Italy was initially less involved with the affairs to the north. Bands of Normans had arrived as mercenaries during a period of warring principalities, and eventually conquered and founded their own states here by the mid-1000s. By the 1130s, Sicily and the southern part of Italy were united by Roger II into a single Norman state. This was the Kingdom of Sicily. Here, the Italo-Normans would build enormous palaces and castles, and secured them with fortifications and keeps. The kingdom passed to the German king, through marriage, and then the French, which proved deeply unpopular. After a revolt in 1282, the island of Sicily overthrew the French, but southern Italy remained united, and became known as the Kingdom of Naples. This stayed in the hands of French nobility until the 1440s, when it was united with Sicily under the Crown of Aragon. It remained a cosmopolitan and tolerant kingdom, mixing strong influences of Arab, Byzantine and Latin culture. While the High Middle Ages was a time of strong government in both England and France, Germany and Italy would remain decentralized for centuries. Further to the east were the Slavs. Their homeland is still widely debated, but scholars generally agree they emerged in Polesia, near present-day Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. During the early Middle Ages, they gradually began expanding, and divided into three groups. Those who migrated west became the West Slavs. One of their first formal states was Great Moravia, founded in 833. Which acted as a balance of power between the Franks to the west, and the Bulgarians and Byzantines to the south. When the king of Moravia needed aid in translating texts into Slavic, two brothers, Byzantine missionaries Cyril and Methodius, created and introduced the Glagolitic alphabet, the first Slavic alphabet. It was the basis for the later Cyrillic. By the High Middle Ages, the West Slavs had established the Polish and Bohemian kingdoms. The West Slavs make up Poles, Czechs, and Slovaks. The Western Slavs ended up being Christianized into the Western Church by German missionaries, and similar missions were also sent south into the Kingdom of Hungary, which was set up by the Magyars. These three groups, the Poles, Czechs, and Hungarians, all became entwined more with Latin culture and the Western Church. The southern Slavs settled in the Balkans and formed their own states, the first of which was Bulgaria, formed by the Slavic tribes and the semi-nomadic Turkic Bulgars in 681. As the Bulgars became Slavicized, their kingdom played an important role in consolidating the Slavic civilization. The southern Slavs also included Croats and Serbs. Some would migrate further south and become Hellenized as part of the Byzantine Empire, an empire we will cover next episode. The southern Slavs generally all became part of the Eastern Church, except for the Croats. The Eastern Slavs moved east into the territory of present-day Ukraine and Western Russia. But soon after, Vikings from Sweden traveled down the long rivers in search of commerce. As they arrived, they would be called Rus by the locals. In the 800s, a semi-legendary Varangian, a Viking conqueror from Sweden, named Rurik, was invited to rule in Novgorod, which was to be the start of the Rurikid dynasty and the beginnings of the Russian state monarchs. Oleg, who is said to be Rurik's kinsman, was his successor. He captured the city of Kiev from the Khazars to the south and settled himself there, establishing the Kievan Rus. His successors greatly expanded this state and it became rich and powerful. Located between the Baltic and Black Sea, with Scandinavia to the north and the Byzantine Empire to the south, the region became a hotbed for trade. The territory came to include the East Slavs, as well as the local Finnic peoples. Through marriage to the Slavs, the Nordic rulers eventually assimilated into Slavic culture. As the Kievan Rus grew, Byzantine missionaries were sent to the Kievan Rus, and in 988, Vladimir the Great converted to the eastern branch of Christianity, along with his state, mixing Byzantine and Russian cultures. The Kievan Rus would later reach its greatest extent under Yaroslav I. After his death, Kievan Rus soon began to struggle and disintegrate into different regional factions, beginning a feudal period where the Grand Prince had little power. Novgorod in the north broke away and declared independence, and later, the Duchy of Vladimir. Once the Byzantine Empire started to decline, they also lost their main source of commerce. In 1240, the Kievan Rus state finally disintegrated after the Mongols besieged Kiev. The city was plundered, and most of the citizens slaughtered. One of the Russian princes, Alexander Nevsky, the Prince of Novgorod, was renowned for protecting the western borders from both German and Swedish invaders. He became Grand Prince, and was not only a fierce warrior, but a skilled diplomat, who acted as an intermediary with the Golden Horde. By simply paying a tax to the invaders, he preserved Russian religion and independence. As Grand Prince, he built churches and created new laws, and Russia was in a period of prosperity. His son would found the Grand Duchy of Moscow, which began as a small outpost in Vladimir, but would eventually expand and lead to a long-lasting Russian state. What truly gave the High Middle Ages its name was the resurgence of culture in its art and intellectualism. The university structure, a word derived from universitas, or the whole, developed as educational guilds, as a means to produce educated intellectuals. Though different kinds of universities appeared elsewhere in the world prior, the first European university was founded in 1088, at Bologna in Italy. There, Irnerius, an Italian jurist, taught the newly rediscovered law code of Justinian, who lived 500 years prior. Students from all over Europe would come here to learn the Roman law, which would become the basis for the laws on the continent for centuries. They first needed to complete the starting curriculum of the liberal arts. The 7 liberal arts taught were grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music theory. Because the printing press had yet to be developed, teaching was usually done via a single book, which a teacher would read aloud, and then give an explanation. This was called a lecture, and remains a fundamental part of universities today. There were no regular exams, however, and students only needed to pass an oral exam when applying for their degree. Their first degree was the Bachelor's of Arts, awarded after 3 or 4 years, but they could pursue a Master of Arts, with the entire process reaching 6 years. After attaining a Master's of Arts degree, a student could continue into higher learning, specializing in law, medicine, or theology. Finishing one of these provided a doctorate degree, which officially allowed them to teach their subjects. Despite law and medicine degrees being important, the most popular doctorate degree was theology. It was viewed as the most pure and intellectual of the sciences in medieval universities. These institutions only increased, and by the end of the Middle Ages, Europe was home to about 80 different universities. Many of the classical Greek works were reintroduced to the West by Jewish and Islamic scholars, and translated by monks at monastic schools. When Western theologians saw many of these texts, they were at odds and even contradicted the Church. One Dominican monk, Thomas Aquinas, was the most influential leader in the Reconciliation. This was done through scholasticism, a philosophy which attempted to harmonize the old works of the early empirical scientists and philosophers, namely Aristotle, with the Catholic doctrine. His Summa Theologica was a compendium of all the main theological teachings of the Catholic Church, and presented the reasoning for all points of Christian theology. He is considered one of the Church's greatest theologians and philosophers, and his synthesis of faith and reason became the new standard. At the start of the High Middle Ages, architecture was based on a style characterized by semicircular arches. This was called the Romanesque style. This kind of architecture was found all over Europe. Though many castles were built during this period, the style, which took influence from the ancient Roman and Greek, was mainly used in churches. Basilicas, known for flat wooden roofs prone to fire, were instead made with a long stone barrel vault. Though they were safer and more aesthetically pleasing, they were quite heavy, so needed massive pillars and thick stone walls to hold it up. This meant less space for windows, and gave Romanesque churches a darker atmosphere, but they are known for their high quality, and many still stand today in more rural areas. But by the 1100s, a newer architectural style emerged in Europe. This style, originating in northern France, evolved from the Romanesque, and came to be known as Gothic. The defining feature was the pointed arch. Instead of barrel vaults, builders used rib vaults along with the pointed arches, resulting in cathedrals that could seemingly soar into the heavens themselves. The flying buttress was another innovation, which spread the weight outwards, instead of straight down. This resulted in thinner, more appealing walls, which could be used to place fantastical stained glass windows, a total change from the Romanesque style. Light from these colorful windows was thought to be a symbol of God's light and His divinity. The first full use of Gothic architecture comes from the abbey at Saint-Denis, near Paris, in the mid-1100s. From there, it spread, and was used in construction of the great French cathedrals, like Notre Dame. A cathedral was a special church that held a cathedra, a seat or throne for the local bishop. Building a Gothic cathedral was a community effort, headed by master masons who designed it, and stonemasons and other craftsmen who made the stunning designs a reality. Now that we've gone through the various European regions, we will take a look at a unifying theme between them, that of Christianity. It touched kings, queens, nobles, and commoners, becoming the framework of European culture. In 1054, because of ecclesiastical, theological, and even political differences between the Latin West and Eastern Greek churches, they officially split into the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches in what is called the Great Schism. The High Middle Ages saw a surge in Christian belief systems and the development of numerous religious orders, both monastic and military. The most influential monastic order was the Order of Cistercians, a group in France that branched off from the earlier Benedictine order. While they continued to follow the rules of Saint Benedict, they were much more strict than the Benedictine monks, and more so followed the order's co-founder, Bernard de Clairvaux. Instead of the black cowl, they donned white ones, and only owned a single robe. They spent less time for services, and more for their manual labor working the fields. Within just 100 years, the order had spread all throughout Europe. Women also came to join these religious orders, as nuns. Instead of child-rearing, women in convents were free to pursue their own intellectual pursuits if they so wished. In the early 1200s, Saint Francis of Assisi, an Italian mystic and Catholic friar, began publicly preaching about repentance and a return to simplicity for the Church. His movement became the Franciscan order, and was quite popular, as it touched the ordinary townsperson. Those who joined the order took a vow of poverty, and traveled far distances in order to preach. Around the same time, a similar order was founded by Spanish priest and mystic, Dominic de Guzman. This was the Dominican order. They were also required to live a life of poverty and to travel to urban areas to preach, but Dominicans were just as concerned with opposing heresy, and any ideas contrary to official church doctrine. To do this, they engaged in a rich scholastic tradition which became the forefront of intellectual life in all Europe. At the end of the medieval period, they would become leading figures in the Spanish Inquisition, but there were medieval inquisitions as well. Both the Dominicans and Franciscans were widely involved with the medieval inquisitions of the 1200s, and the ongoing opposition to heresy that continued for centuries. The religious military orders were societies of Christian knights. They were founded in association with the Crusades, a series of religious wars, primarily in the Levant, but also on the European continent. There was already widespread conflict in Iberia in Al-Andalus, and battles against Muslim armies on the Mediterranean and Sicily, but the Crusades would mark a more organized and collective European effort, initially against another Muslim army that came to occupy territory from Anatolia in the west to the Hindu Kush in the east. These were the Seljuk Turks. After the Eastern Roman Empire suffered defeat at the Battle of Manzikert, it weakened their grip on Anatolia, and led to Turkic settlement on the peninsula, and the establishment of the Sultanate of Rum. The Seljuks had also taken the holy city of Jerusalem, so Eastern Roman Emperor Alexius I asked Pope Urban II for assistance. Seeing an opportunity to unite the warring Christian kingdoms of Europe to face a common enemy, Pope Urban called for a holy war, or crusade, at the Council of Clermont in 1095. This was to be a simple pilgrimage, but these pilgrims came with swords. After the Pope promised remission of sins for anyone who partook in the crusade and died, the fervor reached even the poor, who had very little in this life. Peter the Hermit was a pious man who preached in public on the streets of France. He gathered others like him, the paupers of society, and in 1096, they made their way east, in what has been called the People's Crusade. There had been a comet sighting, meteor shower, and lunar eclipse in the year leading up to the march, so these were probably taken as a sign from God. As the peasants, which numbered in the tens of thousands, moved east, they terrorized the non-Christian populations of the Rhineland, leading to the massacre of thousands of Jewish men, women, and children. Some of Peter the Hermit's band actually reached Constantinople and were given safe passage across to Anatolia. But that's where the poorly armed rabble was subsequently slaughtered by the Turks. Peter the Hermit ironically survived though, as he was visiting Constantinople at the time. This failed People's Crusade wasn't backed by any official power, but the first official crusade took place soon after, and was led by trained fighters and noble men of war. Most of the army, numbering around 100,000, was French, but smaller armies from Christian Europe also joined. Along the way, the armies recaptured Nicaea from the Seljuks, and then marched down into the Levant, and captured Jerusalem in 1099. After taking the city, and the mass killing of Jews and Muslims alike, the Crusaders founded states of their own, much to the dismay of the Byzantine emperor. This crusade was Europe's first major victory abroad, but certainly not the last. As the Crusader states were blocked off on all sides by hostile forces, they traded over the Mediterranean, leading to the Italian cities, like Genoa and Venice, becoming quite rich and powerful as masters of maritime commerce. Decades later, in 1144, the county of Edessa fell, and calls rang out for a second crusade. This one was headed by actual kings, with French King Louis VII, husband of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Conrad III, the German king, leading the charge. An ill-advised attack on Damascus ruined any chances of success, and the crusade ended in defeat. On their way though, Crusaders did manage to help in the reconquest effort on the Iberian Peninsula, helping the Portuguese capture Lisbon. After the rise of Saladin and fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Europe felt compelled to undertake a third crusade. This crusade was to be led by three notable kings, so is dubbed the King's Crusade. From England was Henry II, but after his death, his son with Eleanor of Aquitaine took up the mantle. He was King Richard I. Le Coeur de Lion. Richard the Lionheart. From France was the bane of the English, Philip II. England and France set aside their rivalry for this crusade. From Germany, with the largest army, was the elderly Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa. They made the trek by land, but Frederick was never to see his destination. In Anatolia, he drowned in a river, and most of his grieving army abandoned the crusade. The French and English armies made their way by sea, and with an impressive fleet, made quick inroads into the Levant. They recaptured Acre and Jaffa, and though they succeeded militarily, they never recaptured Jerusalem, the main goal of the campaign. Once King Philip returned home in 1191, King Richard and Saladin signed a treaty, leaving Jerusalem in Muslim hands but open to free passage for unarmed pilgrims. In return, the Crusaders could keep the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa, in effect restoring the Crusader states. Still, neither side was happy with this outcome. Once Saladin died in 1193, and Richard in 1199, Pope Innocent III fanned the flames of crusade once again, and in 1202, Christian forces would head out to the Holy Land from the ports of Venice. This wasn't a king's crusade like the Third, but mostly composed of French nobility. At the suggestion of some Venetian captains as payment for safe travel, the crusade ended up going wayward, and became embroiled in a succession plot in Constantinople. The Crusaders eventually sacked the city, and in 1204 set up their own empire in former Byzantine territory, calling it the Latin Empire. The Byzantines only survived as three separate rump states, each claiming to be the empire's true successor. Though the Byzantines reclaimed their cities by 1261, the attack not only cemented the rift between the Latin and Orthodox churches, but led to the Eastern Empire's steep decline. The subsequent crusades are generally regarded as less important. During the Fifth Crusade, Europeans changed their strategy, and instead targeted Egypt first, which was still ruled by Saladin's brother. The Crusaders ultimately failed to reach Cairo though, and a truce was called. The Sixth Crusade was headed solely by King Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, without papal involvement. While he lacked the manpower to retake Jerusalem, he succeeded in his quest through diplomacy. 2 decades later, the French king, Louis IX, conducted 2 crusades of his own in response to the Muslim retaking of the Holy City. The Seventh Crusade saw his army meet disaster, and King Louis was taken captive. After he was released, he refused to give up his campaigning, and launched the Eighth Crusade, but shortly after arriving in North Africa, he died of dysentery. After Germany and France, England had their go in 1271, in the Ninth Crusade. This was led by Lord Edward, the Duke of Gascony, and by this time, it wasn't Saladin's Ayyubids who controlled the region, but the Mamluk Sultanate under Baybars. Though both sides saw success, it was the Crusaders who lacked the final blow, and a truce was called. Lord Edward returned home and eventually became Edward I, King of England, who we mentioned before as Edward Longshanks. During this time, the Mamluks besieged the remaining Crusader states, and they were captured one by one, until 1291, when Acre, the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, fell. It was here that 200 years of Crusader states came to an end. The Levant was to remain in Mamluk hands for the time being. The Knights Hospitaller originated from a reform movement in the Benedictine monastic order. They were originally formed to provide medical aid to Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, but soon became more militaristic after the First Crusade. They eventually came to run most hospitals in the region, and built them all over Europe as well. After the Crusades, the Knights fled to Rhodes, and then Malta, and even partook in the voyages to the New World, briefly acquiring 4 islands in the Caribbean. The Knights Templar was the most famous and influential of the military orders. Known for their distinctive red cross on white mantle, they were founded in 1119, in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, with the goal of defending Christian pilgrimage to the sacred sites. Though they struggled at first, they had an advocate in Bernard de Clairvaux, and became officially approved as a religious order in 1129. Though only 10% were knights, many of their members took to banking, creating a large economic infrastructure that linked the Levant and Europe. Despite their monastic vows, they became the wealthiest of the military orders, owning land and castles throughout the Crusader states. There were many other more minor crusades to the Holy Land, but also many major ones on the continent as well. One of the most prominent of these were the Northern Crusades. The Northern Crusades were mainly headed by the Teutonic Order, known as the Teutonic Knights. They were originally founded from a German fraternity, active during the Third Crusade in 1191. After the unsuccessful crusade, they turned their attention towards Europe, setting up base in the north after conquering the Old Prussians, a Baltic people with a common link to the Slavs. Further east were another pagan Baltic people, the Lithuanians. To better defend themselves from the Teutons on one side, and the Eastern Slavs to the other, they coalesced into a state in 1251. In 1386, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila, formed a dynastic union with Poland by marrying Queen Jadwiga, and converting his state to Christianity. In 1410, Lithuania and Poland defeated the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Grunwald, after which the Northern Crusaders went into decline. Though there was tension between the nobility at first, Poland and Lithuania would become inextricably linked at the start of the next age. By the beginning of the 1300s, Europe entered a new era of decline and catastrophe, ushering in the late Middle Ages. Changes in climate brought colder weather, darkened skies, and frigid rains from constant storms. This was known as the Little Ice Age and led to widespread famine. The Great Famine of 1315–17, which brought with it extreme increases in crime, mass death, and perhaps even cannibalism, was but the first crisis of this tumultuous period. By the middle of the century, another threat was looming. It would attack through seaports and trade routes, yet showed no sword, and shot no arrow. This was a disease that would turn into the most fatal recorded pandemic in human history. This was called the Black Death, and was responsible for killing up to half of the population in Eurasia and the Mediterranean basin. This was caused by bubonic plague, which found a host in fleas. The fleas themselves spread from the backs of black rats. Its origins are still disputed, but it most likely entered China via the Mongols, and by the 1330s, it had already spread rapidly, reducing the Chinese population by tens of millions. The safe and efficient trading networks established by the Pax Mongolica helped this disease transmit westwards. Commerce would stop at Constantinople in the west, and by 1347, the city was ravaged. By 1348, it had spread all over the Near East. Egypt's population was so devastated that it did not reach its pre-plague levels for another 600 years. In Europe, The Black Death most likely entered through the east. The Golden Horde hurled disease-infested corpses over the walls during the siege of Kaffa. This city was a trading center for Genoese merchants, so when these merchants fled, they returned to Italy, bringing the plague with them on their ships. It had spread to southern Italy and France by the end of the year, perhaps the pneumonic version of the plague, which spread through the air. More recently, it has been theorized that the main crux of spread wasn't through rats, but instead through the lice and fleas living on humans. The tight urban centers of France and Italy often neglected personal hygiene, and were known for having filthy streets. Some were even named as such, like Rue Mergier and Ruelle de Pipi. In just 4 years, the entirety of Europe was affected. A few areas remained little affected though, as they had less trade relations and remained more isolated, like the Basques, a people thought to predate the Indo-European migrations to the continent. In total, Europe might have lost up to 38 million people in just 4 or 5 years, half of its population. This brought with it extreme societal, political, and religious instability. Some felt the plague was sent by God in order to punish society for its sins. One self-mutilating band roamed from town to town where the plague hit hardest, flogging themselves with whips, begging their vengeful deity for forgiveness. They were known as the flagellants, and would come to cause chaos wherever they went. Once they started attacking Jews and members of the clergy, the Pope condemned the movement, and it soon fizzled out by 1351. The flagellants weren't the only source of anti-Semitism. It was on the rise all over Europe. In Germany, dozens of major Jewish communities were destroyed, and many fled east to Russia and Poland, where they were given more protections. The plague also caused economic instability. With around half the population snapped out of existence within such a short time, the great medieval industries couldn't adapt, and production fell by more than half. This ended up benefiting the lower classes. With less workers, the value of labor rose dramatically. Food prices also fell as there was less demand. More peasants were able to work their way out of serfdom. Monarchs, however, felt emboldened to impose higher taxes. In England, the king needed to generate more revenue for a military campaign, so imposed a poll tax, a flat tax per individual. Peasants refused to pay this tax, and in 1381, they revolted. Beginning in Essex, the upheaval soon spread, leading to mass executions of government officials, and the sacking of the Tower of London. Though King Richard II suppressed the peasant revolt, and had the leaders executed, the poll tax was eventually discontinued. Though the impact of the peasant uprising is still debated, it opened the door to a period of more populist uprisings, where the poor could also be heard. The tax system was initially put in place to raise revenues for a military campaign. This was a war that began almost 50 years earlier, in 1337, and pit England and France against each other for over a century. This was the 100 Years' War, and further added to the extreme crisis of the late Middle Ages. The conflict was the culmination of the rivalry between France and England, who had become inextricably linked to France through their Norman and Angevin kings. Once a trio of Capetian kings failed to produce a male heir, there was a succession crisis. King Edward III of England had a legitimate claim to the throne, as grandson of a former French king. But in the end, they chose Philip, the Count of Valois, to become King Philip VI in 1328. He was the first king from the House of Valois, a cadet branch of the Capetians. After years of failed negotiations and an escalation of conflict, Philip confiscated the Duchy of Gascony, the only remaining English holding in France. For Edward, this meant war. The fearsome French armies were generally composed of high-ranking and heavily armored knights and nobles. The English relied more on infantrymen and foot soldiers. Their deadliest weapon was the longbow, most likely adopted from the Welsh. The 100 Years' War began in 1337, with minor skirmishes and naval battles, but the first major engagement was in 1346 at Cressy, near Flanders. Edward and his eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, scored resounding success against the more numerous French cavalry. After a short pause caused by the Black Death, fighting again resumed in the 1350s, and the English armies scored another resounding victory at Poitiers, capturing the new French king, John II, and holding him for ransom. In 1360, both kings signed the Treaty of Bretigny, a seeming end to the war. England would get to keep an expanded territory of Aquitaine free and clear, headed by Edward the Black Prince. There were to be no more complications with lord and vassal relationships with France. In return, the King of England was to renounce his claims to the throne. This period of the war was called the Edwardian phase. But 9 years later, in 1369, France had a new king, Charles V, or Charles the Wise. In just a few years, he worked to retake the territory taken by the English. The French armies dominated this period of the war, which is named after the French king, and lasted until 1389. Charles VI, new King of France, and Richard II, who took over from his grandfather Edward, signed a truce that would last for over 25 years. While England went through Henry IV, and crowned Henry V in 1413, Charles VI was still King of France, but had descended into madness, so became known as Charles the Mad. With cracks in the French nobility, and an ineffectual king, King Henry launched another invasion in 1415. As he was part of the House of Lancaster, a cadet branch of the Plantagenets, this third phase was known as the Lancastrian phase. His first true test came at Agincourt, where he and his small band of brothers almost perished under the assault of the heavily armored French knights. But the English longbowmen saved the day, along with an assist from the weather and muddy conditions. Henry was able to return to England, and by 1420, he had returned to capture Normandy and Paris, and was on his way to conquer France itself. His marriage to Charles VI's daughter, Catherine of Valois, cemented an heir that would unify the thrones of England and France. They had one child, Henry VI, but the entire war was about to be turned on its head. Just 2 years later, in 1422, Henry died of dysentery, a mere 2 months before Charles the Mad had died, and his son, Henry VI, was still an infant, so could not yet rule. His reign was then disputed, and the title fell to Charles VI's only surviving son, Charles the Dauphin, who still controlled southern France. His actual coronation was only possible because of a very special young lady, who claimed to experience divine voices and divine visions, all in service of a divine mission. Beginning a year prior, the Siege of Orléans was France's last gasp. England was at the pinnacle of its power, and after a siege of 6 months and 2 weeks, central France was to fall. But with the arrival of a French girl, called Joan the Maid, French spirit was revitalized, and in just 9 days, the French broke the siege. This is generally regarded as a watershed moment in the war, as the French army slowly reconquered the territories taken by the English, crushing them at Patay in 1429, and Formigny in 1450. In 1453, the Battle of Castillon marked the final battle in the 100 Years' War, and the loss of all English territories in France, except for Calais. The Maid of Orléans, or Joan of Arc, didn't see the French victory, as she was captured by the Burgundians, allies of the English, and was burned at the stake in 1431, accused of witchcraft and heresy. The verdict has since been nullified, and she remains a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. Charles became known as Charles the Victorious, and would rule France until 1461. His promotion of gunpowder weapons proved decisive in the French victories over the English. Once gunpowder came in from the east, it marked a new age in Europe, as castles were now vulnerable to cannons, and the armor of knights became less protective and more of a hindrance. The image of the brave knight would begin to decline around this time, as lords and rulers began hiring their own more reliable professional armies, instead of vassal knights. This marked a shift away from the feudal system that would only continue into the next age. The Church, which reached its zenith in the High Middle Ages, began to decline as the period ended. The centralized Kingdom of France was more able to challenge papal supremacy. In the early 1300s, King Philip IV flexed his muscle, warring in Aquitaine and Flanders, expelling the Jews, and destroying the Order of the Knights Templar, having members burned at the stake. His most famous struggle, though, was with the Pope Boniface VIII. To cement his monarchical powers, Philip had imposed a tax on clergy members, but Boniface insisted that monarchs had no jurisdiction to tax clergy members without papal approval. So Philip did the only thing he could. He kidnapped the Pope. The Pope was kept in France and beaten badly for days. When he was eventually released, his condition worsened, and soon after, he was dead. Philip then orchestrated another papal election, and a Frenchman, Clement V, became the new pope. Claiming unrest in Rome, Clement moved the papacy to Avignon, in France, and took up residence there. This caused resentment in the Western Church, as popes had always been linked to Rome, through the papacy of Peter. It led to much criticism and a devaluing of the Church. After numerous popes came and went, it was Pope Gregory XI, the seventh and last Avignon pope, who returned the papacy to Rome in 1377, after 70 years of papal courts in France. But this wasn't the end of the blow to papal prestige. Gregory died the spring after his return, in 1378, and it was time for the election of a new pope. As the majority of cardinals were French, the people of Rome were concerned they would simply vote for another Frenchman who might take the papacy back to Avignon. They wanted a Roman, or at least an Italian. With a lot of coaxing and a lot of threats, the cardinals chose the Archbishop of Bari, a native Italian from the Kingdom of Naples, to be Pope Urban VI. But just a few months later, the French cardinals claimed the election was illegitimate, and chose another man from France, Clement VII, to be the real pope. He moved to Avignon soon after, and suddenly, the Catholic Church had two popes, one in Rome and one at Avignon. This became known as the Western Schism, similar to the Great Schism that tore Catholic and Orthodox Christianity apart. The schism thoroughly divided Europe, as France and its allies remained loyal and recognized the Avignon popes, and England and its allies recognized the Roman popes. This led to a reform movement known as conciliarism, which held that it was not the Pope that was supreme, but the whole ecumenical council. At the Council of Constance from 1414 to 1418, in Germany, this was put into practice, and the popes were made to resign or were deposed. The council then elected a new pope in 1417, Martin V, and established that the council, not the pope, had supreme authority over certain matters. This would be the last papal election outside of Italy. This ended the Western Schism, but the conciliar movement failed long-term, and popes began to reassert dominance. But the damage was done, and the morality and prestige of the Church suffered dearly. Crisis after crisis had struck Europe during the late Middle Ages, but from the ashes, there was a rebirth. In Italy, during the mid-1300s, people sought out new meaning, apart from the Church, and found it in the older works of classical Greece and Rome. This rebirth came to be called the Renaissance. The Italian city-states became more urbanized and more secular. During the recovery period following the instability, Italians became wealthy once again, and chose to spend their wealth on more material or individualistic pursuits. This could be seen with the rise of Renaissance humanism, an intellectual movement focused on the nature and importance of humanity, emerging from the study of the ancient classics. Scholars attended university to study the liberal arts, many of which came to be known as the humanities. Petrarch, a poet and Renaissance scholar, is credited for initiating this humanist movement. He gathered Latin manuscripts from all over, and emphasized their teaching in classical Latin. These humanists were still Christian, but saw themselves as purifying and renewing the faith. During the 1400s, humanists would become more involved with politics and civil affairs. they came to hold prominent positions in the courts and as advisors. Leonardo Bruni is regarded as the most influential humanist historian of the early Renaissance, and was the first recorded historian to divide history into the three segments of ancient, Middle Ages, and modern. He also became one of the first Italian humanists to pursue the study of classical Greece and translated the Greek works of Aristotle. He also wrote the biographies of prominent figures like Petrarch and Dante. Dante Alighieri lived earlier during the Middle Ages, and is regarded as one of the most influential Italian writers, and perhaps one of the foremost in the world. His Divine Comedy, and his depictions of heaven, purgatory, and hell, have had profound influence on Western literature and Western art. Boccaccio was another proto-Renaissance writer, and friend of Petrarch. His most famous works were the Decameron, a collection of short stories, and Concerning Famous Women, biographies of both legendary and historical women, like the goddess Minerva, and Cleopatra. Together, Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio are regarded as the Three Crowns, literary masters who laid the foundation of the humanist movement in Florence, and influenced the development of a standardized Italian language. Women of higher rank also partook in the intellectual humanist movement. Isolta Nogarola, one of the first major female humanists, would inspire generations of writers and poets. Laura Serreta wrote about her personal experiences as a critique against misogyny, and is considered one of the first proto-feminist writers. Closely linked with Renaissance humanist philosophy was Renaissance art. It was based on the art of classical antiquity, but mixed in more current scientific ideas. Human beings were to be the center of focus in this art style, reflecting the more humanist ideals. The founding of the Medici Bank brought untold wealth to Florence, so it became a hotbed for artistic minds. The frescoes of Masaccio, a painter so named for his disheveled appearance, are regarded as some of the first and finest pieces of art from the early Renaissance. New measures for perspective were added, and paintings became more natural and realistic, a style which is aptly called naturalism or realism. Masaccio also brought about a new sense of expression and emotion to art, which can be seen on this fresco of Adam and Eve, whose faces convey the extreme grief and shame of being expelled from the Garden of Eden. Onlookers could stare at a painting and feel a sense of depth, like their worlds were intertwined. Filippo Brunelleschi, a Florentine architect and designer, and good friend of Masaccio, was thought to have developed this sense of linear perspective after visits to see the storied ruins in Rome. He became skilled at engineering and is considered a founding father of Renaissance architecture. His most famous work was the building of the dome on the Florence Cathedral. Inspired by what he saw in Rome, he also designed the Church of San Lorenzo in a more classical style, with classical columns and more rounded arches, a departure from the Gothic art styles which had come to dominate. One of Masaccio and Brunelleschi's friends, who might have accompanied them to Rome during visits, was a young sculptor named Donato di Niccolo, but he is better known to us as Donatello. He used his knowledge of classical scripture in his art, creating two marvelous sculptures of David, one made of marble for a religious setting, and the other made of bronze, displaying David in the nude. This was the first freestanding piece of nude male sculpture since antiquity. These artists paved the way for what was to come. By around 1500, a short but exceptional period of art began. Artists had learned and built upon their predecessors, leading to the part of the period that is more familiar to most, the High Renaissance. This was dominated by three artistic masters. Regarded as the pinnacle of humanist ideals in Italy, was Leonardo da Vinci, who built the foundations of the High Renaissance. He was a polymath, and excelled not just at painting, but as an engineer, scientist, sculptor, and architect. Da Vinci built on the naturalism and realism of the early Renaissance, to instead portray humans in their ideal forms. To do this, he dissected and studied human cadavers. In his journals, there are also notes and depictions of human emotions, babies in the womb, animals, rock formations, war machines, and even flying machines. Much of his work has been lost, but he is mainly remembered for his paintings. Though the Mona Lisa and Last Supper are the most popular, it was his Salvator Mundi that became the highest-selling painting of all time in 2017, selling for $450 million American dollars. One of his younger contemporaries, and major rival, was the Italian sculptor and painter, Michelangelo. He is most well known for his two famous sculptures, Pietà, and his version of David, both created before he was 30 years old. He was also responsible for two of the most influential frescoes in Western art. The first, painted from 1508 to 1512, was on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The fresco depicted 9 scenes from the book of Genesis in the Bible, the central piece being the creation of Adam. The muscular figures portray the ideal human form, and is meant to also reflect their inner beauty. His other famous fresco was the Last Judgment, which was just below the ceiling painting, on the altar wall. It portrays the final judgment and return of Christ, with some of the dead rising to the heavens, while others are not quite as lucky. One of Michelangelo's rivals was the young Raphael, who became a prodigy, most well known for his Raphael rooms featuring frescoes that rivaled Michelangelo's best works. One of these rooms, the Room of the Signatura, featured perhaps his most famous work, the School of Athens. The painting displays the harmony between Christian teachings and Greek philosophy, and is the epitome of the classical spirit of the Renaissance. The period of the Renaissance also saw a shift in politics as the modern age approached. With the adoption of portable firearms and private armies, kings and queens were able to create stronger centralized governments and unify their nations, allowing for expansion and discovery. Historians have called these new monarchs. The Kingdom of France was left reeling after the devastation of the 100 Years' War, but national pride was never higher. This made it easy for monarchs to garner more power. Charles VII had spent his reign settling civil disputes and expelling the English armies, setting up France to become the foremost power on the continent. King Louis XI, son of Charles VII, was known for his political machinations and devious conspiracies. Once you entered his web, it wasn't long before you were devoured. It was no wonder his nickname was l'Universel Lorraine, Middle French for the Universal Spider. As national pride was high, he reformed the tax system, and imposed permanent land and property taxes that gave him a continuous stream of revenue. England, just off their defeat against France, had problems at home for another 30 years, as the cost of the war put a strain on the English economy. Henry V's son, Henry VI, next in the Lancastrian line, the boy who was almost king of a united England and France, proved to be an ineffectual and weak leader, even at home. Challenging the throne, aristocratic factions rose up under the House of York, who, like the Lancasters, were a cadet branch of the Plantagenets. Henry was deposed twice, dying under unclear circumstances in 1471, and replaced with Edward IV, who ruled England unopposed for another 12 years before his death in 1483. A seeming victory for the Yorkists. But the war was not yet finished. The heir to the throne was Edward's 12-year-old son, Edward V, but he wouldn't even see coronation. Both he and his 9-year-old younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, mysteriously vanished after lodging at the Tower of London. It is widely accepted that their uncle Richard had them murdered, but there is no concrete evidence. It could have been someone from a rival house, or they could have simply escaped and ran away. Though their uncle Richard then took the crown as Richard III, the story of the princes in the tower still remains a mystery. The cloud of fog surrounding Richard's assumption of the throne didn't sit well with many Yorkists, and there was a significant uprising, with many Yorkists rebelling and siding with the Lancasters. Though this was put down, the tides of war shifted. In 1485, the Wars of the Roses finally ended at the Battle of Bosworth, when Henry Tudor, from the Welsh House of Tudor, And the House of Lancaster, with a coalition of English, Welsh, Scottish, and French troops, defeated the Yorkists, and Richard III perished on the battlefield. As both the houses of Lancaster and York now had no legitimate male heirs, both houses became extinct, and the House of Plantagenet, monarchs of England, dating back 300 years earlier to the reign of Henry II and the Angevin kings, finally came to an end. Henry Tudor became King Henry VII and married Elizabeth of the House of York, putting an end to the Civil War, and beginning the Tudor period of England's history. Christian Spain was divided into a series of small kingdoms in the north, slowly fighting to regain the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslim armies during the Reconquista. Two of the most powerful of these Christian kingdoms were Castile and Aragon. The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 was the first step in the unification of Spain, and in just a few decades, the reconquest was complete, and Spain was on the way to creating one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Further east, the Duchy of Moscow would continue to grow. Under Grand Prince Ivan III, Moscow was extended through conquest, as he seized the lands which would one day become a large empire. Ivan was married to Sophia, a Byzantine princess, of the imperial Palaiologos family. As Constantinople was regarded as New Rome, Ivan fashioned Moscow after it, referring to his city as the Third Rome. He adopted the Byzantine double eagle as his kingdom's coat of arms, and in 1480, expelled the remnants of the Golden Horde at the Battle of the Ugra, or Great Stand at the Ugra River, gaining independence, and marking the dawn of a new era for what would become the Russian state. Italy wouldn't become united until later, but was dominated by 5 different powers by the end of the medieval period. In the north, Venice remained an independent republic ruled by an elected doge, and dominated the sea lanes. Nearby, the Duchy of Milan was still officially part of the Holy Roman Empire, but became centralized through a series of strong dukes from the Visconti and Sforza families. The Republic of Florence came about when the Florentines formed an independent commune. The Medici family gained governance of the city in 1434, and continued as Grand Dukes once it was turned into a monarchy by the Pope in 1569. In central and southern Italy remained the Papal States and the Kingdom of Naples. Though they were all strong in their own right, they still held a delicate balance of power between them. But individually, they were no match for the other Western centralized powers, and Italy became the battleground for the Italian Wars, which saw France embroiled in conflict with Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, an alliance of Italian states. Once the Italian Wars finally ended, France lay defeated, and Spain regained their rule over southern Italy, as well as the Duchy of Milan, and cemented themselves as a new dominant power in Europe. During the Italian Wars, an influential Italian author and diplomat wrote a political treatise that was so influential that he is considered the father of modern political philosophy and political science. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, and his greatest work was Il Principe, or The Prince. It dealt with the means of acquiring, maintaining, and expanding political power. It was in stark contrast to the chivalrous and princely ideals of the Middle Ages, and claimed a ruler has the right to lie, deceive, and use violence whenever necessary. That the ends justified the means, and morality was just an obstacle. It was controversial, as some saw it as simply a realistic view of what politics had always been, but others saw it as a guide for new tyrants to learn from. Machiavelli was the first Western thinker to justify this abandonment of morality. In Central Europe, the House of Habsburg, founded during the 11th century, would later come to prominence as Archdukes of Austria, Kings of Germany, and Emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, although this title meant very little by this point. Once Spanish monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand died, the Habsburg son of the Holy Roman Emperor was sent to marry their daughter. Their son together, Charles, would establish the beginnings of Habsburg Spain, and it quickly reached its apex under his rule. He not only became Holy Roman Emperor, with holdings in northern Italy, Austria, and the Burgundian Low Countries, but also the vast territories of the Spanish Empire, which consisted of Iberia and southern Italy. During the Italian Wars, his European control gave him access to a large body of forces from all over the continent, including German Landsknecht, Spanish tercios, Burgundian knights, and Italian condottieri. By this time, Charles' empire also consisted of lands abroad, in what would be called the New World. The Age of Discovery awaits, but that's a story we'll get to in our next mega documentary, so be sure to subscribe.